I'm Mary Ann Edens. I am the program director for LSU Shreveport, but I also hold the hat of being the person who advises all the medical students identified as possibly going into EM. So I hold both hats. And then this is, I'll let him introduce himself.
Josh Wallenstein, clerkship director at Emory, and also sort of do the bulk of the student advising for our students that are going into EM.
So, and we're going to talk a little bit about advising the bottom third student. We heard a lot in the last session about the bottom third student, but we want to make this somewhat interactive. So we've actually got 4 students that we're going to talk about, 2 of whom are fairly easy to advise, and 2 of whom are maybe a little harder to advise. So I actually am going to take the easier ones, and Josh has the harder ones, but during his, I'm going to walk around the room and we're going to open it up to people and ask them how they would try to advise this student some. So these are our objectives. So it kind of goes through the cases. So student number 1 is the student who comes in for late advice during his 3rd year. Okay, so this is the typical kid that we're seeing in the last month or so. He reports that EM is his calling, and he wants to discuss it, his 4th year planning. You find that he's failed step 1 twice and finally passed on his 3rd attempt. He also had to repeat his 2nd year because he failed 3 courses. So this one's easy, right? This is the dream crusher. I am so sorry, but you are not going to get in EM. You're not going to get into EM. And I have had this conversation twice already this year. If you are the person who cannot have this conversation, what do you say? Well, it's unlikely you're going to get into EM. You better make a backup plan right now. But in some respects, I've actually had both students come to me about a week to 2 weeks after I told them you're not going to get into EM, and they actually came up and thanked me because they said, you made it so much easier for me to make my decision of what else I was going to go into. So you may need to think about that sometimes the dream crusher can be the inventor of the new dream as well. All right, Josh has student 2, and this is the interactive one. So,
all right, my one request before getting started is that these cases are loosely, or in some cases not so loosely, based around the lives of real people. Most of whom I'm happy to say, at least the ones that I kind of contributed to, found a happy home in EM. And while there's obviously nothing here that can identify them and they're fairly generic, I just still ask that you use your discretion in sort of how you share these. They're on the handout. Please take pictures of the slides if you want, but I ask that you sort of not put these on Twitter just to try to be respectful, perhaps overly or just extra respectful of people's privacy. So this is a student, I'm not just going to, I'll try to kind of paint a more general picture. This is a student who in their 1st and 2nd year of medical school did great. They got mostly A's. They did great on step 1. But when they got into clinical rotations, things started to slip a little bit. They got mostly B's, and picture they got maybe 1 C in medicine or in surgery. And then they come to your rotation and they struggle a little more than normal. Leave out the clinical reasoning part because I think that just sort of makes this a little more complicated than it needs to be. But they have some issues with presentations, and there seem to be some kind of suggestion of odd mannerisms or kind of personality quirks. This is not, I know every once in a while we have this student that like really freaks us out that we're worried we're going to see in handcuffs in the evening news in a couple of years. I'm not talking about that student. I'm not talking about the person that you really think, you're worried they're sinister or deviant. This is just the kid who is perhaps a little bit odd. Maybe has nervous tics, some problems with sort of interpersonal space, boundaries. Have we all had kind of students like this? I think maybe. On the maybe program director side, this is when you get a SLOE where kind of everything looks okay, maybe not great, but someone who did okay in the clerkship, maybe got a pass, even a high pass. You get to the 2nd page of the SLOE and everything is maybe right in the middle, but then all of a sudden you get to those last kind of two key questions of overall ranking and where they'll be on the match list, and all of a sudden they're in the lower third, and there's not a whole lot of explanation in their narrative. So that's kind of the picture of the student or the applicant that I think we've all seen. What do you guys do? Say after the SLOE is written, before they've started interviews.
So anybody have any ideas of what y'all would do?
If it's a mannerism, personality, fit thing, I think that fit is something that the PDs are going to look on with a lot of really kid gloves. They're going to be very careful about someone who doesn't fit well. So I'm going to recommend a backup specialty, and based on the student's preferences. Go ahead.
Do I know anybody at another program who this kid might fit with? Let's say he's a little bit more quiet, but I know somebody who likes a little bit more quiet folks, and I advise him to go.
Our next, let's just say for clarification, this is beyond, our next case is a student who's a little quiet. This is someone who, a little, again, not deviant, but a little odd, more than just quiet. Think of it as mannerisms, tics, vocal intonations, things that kind of maybe get in the way of communication.
With personal space, whatever. Does the student understand it?
Well, let's say no. What would you do?
I don't want to answer that. That's your job. So, all right. My conflict of interest is that I have a brother on the spectrum, and he's weird. All right. He's brilliant, but he is weird. He is that kid who is stellar and is going to get an A on any test that you give him. But when you put him in a stressful, chaotic environment like the emergency department, he's going to struggle, like really struggle. He is a mathematician. If any of you guys know mathematicians, they're real weird. So he does real well there. Okay. So you know what? His colleagues, they don't care that he's weird. And I hope I don't offend anyone, but in EM, I think it is hard for real weird people to deal with the days and the ins and outs and the struggles and the chaos and the personality disorders that we all manage in all of our consultants. I would probably advise this kid to go into something else, maybe pathology, because they're weird.
Go ahead.
So I've had this student a couple of times. It's not even, private. And it's hard because it is hard to tell somebody your personality is a problem. Luckily, they don't do as well clinically in emergency medicine. So I've framed it in the, your scores in emergency medicine were lower than your peers. And so our letter's not going to be as strong. We're happy to write that. I have advised all of them to have a backup plan, kind of encourage them to go into other things, but when they say they really want to do it, have been very firm about backup plans, and half the time they've ended up in the backup plan, half the time they've matched. But I think it actually is easier when their clinical scores aren't super to be able to.
So just for the sake of time, we'll do two more comments, then we'll move on to the next case. But thank you.
I think some students are naturally introspective, and some of them, our greatest role is to help them recognize the things about themselves that may be a good fit or may not be a good fit. So I think I would open the discussion with the student, but that's great that you're interested in EM. What aspects about yourself do you think are really good fits for EM? Is there anything about yourself that you think may not be a great strength for EM? And sort of have them maybe realize that their strengths don't line up necessarily with what they're going to need to succeed, and then maybe help them find something where they do align a little bit better and just sort of help them get there themselves as opposed to sort of imposing it on them.
I don't know who the student is, but when you say tics and vocalizations and stuff, I immediately think the kid has Tourette's, right? And so do they have a diagnosable thing? I think if I had comments like that, I would talk to them about, is this a thing? And then that is something that you can address with them, is this is going to get in the way, especially if it's a pathologic diagnosis, neuropsychiatric diagnosis, address with them. So how are we going to work with this? How are we going to deal with it? Because it is quite frankly going to turn people away unless they unless you address it up front. And so again, am a huge believer in the backup plan for students that I'm concerned about, but I also would address this head on with them, I think, especially if it was tics and verbal.
So just to finish this case up, there was a comment earlier on insight, and fortunately this student did have a lot of insight, and my suggestion, what we did with this student, which wasn't easy, it really is honesty and having hard conversations and honest conversations and saying, look, you're strong clinically in many ways, but people have found issues with with some mannerisms, and it's a very hard conversation to have. And you do have to be careful because there are some disability issues that you have to be very sensitive to. Some of this has been mentioned, may be related to either diagnosed or undiagnosed mental health issues. But we were able to really have honest conversations with the student, point out the specific behaviors that were noticed. What we actually did with this student is we all use OSCEs. Our students have the ability to look at their OSCEs at any time. We went through some of his OSCE encounters with him. We pointed out those behaviors. And again, it has a happy ending. There were certainly bumps on the road because the student did struggle with interviews, but I think largely because the student did have insight, we were successful.
Okay, so my next student is solidly average student, slightly above average throughout medical school, struggled a little bit maybe on the EM rotations, mostly because they were a little introverted. My residents are a pretty boisterous group, and this person was not. Middle third, or had 2 SLOEs, both in the middle third. Okay, so great personality, will be a strong EM resident, will be fine. Just a little quiet and may need a little more guidance and a little help getting out of their shell. Comes to me in late October and says, I've only got 6 interviews. I'm in trouble. What do I do? So I'll tell you what I did. I said, you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. And we all know, we've all seen the data that the vast majority of students actually match within their top 3 programs, right? So and the student, you can't tell them that. They don't understand that. They don't get it. But I told him to hold his breath before he started panicking, hold his breath, and just wait another week or 2 and see what happens. 4 more interviews came in the next 2 weeks. So he ended up being very happy. He ended up ranking. He ended up matching, and it was fine. But the one thing that I thought about was, what was I going to tell him in 2 more weeks if nothing else came? And so you need to start thinking, and basically what I thought about what I was going to tell him is, let's think of a backup plan of what to do if you don't match. And you hate to tell a student this early in the game because they probably haven't even gone on their interviews yet. But it's perhaps a little easier to tell them that if you set the expectation of there is the possibility you won't match. Now, this is a time when a backup plan for another specialty probably isn't going to work, because putting in applications to family medicine or internal medicine in November, while it might work, they're probably still not going to get a whole heck of a lot of interviews. Most of those interviews are already gone, right? And it also looks like, well, this is their backup plan. It's a different story when you do backup plans in July and you start with a backup plan than it is if you do a backup plan really late. So I will tell them, well, you might be able to do that and you might be successful, but it might be just as good to also figure out what your backup plan is going to be if on match day you don't have any name on your thing. And it's the time to start thinking about, would you consider another specialty? Or do you want to try this again, which again has all the pros and pitfalls of what happens. You know, we all know that trying it the second time, they're not nearly as successful. but it's the conversation. And if you have that conversation with them early, they actually are going to be much happier than trying to have that conversation on Monday of match week when it opens. They open that envelope and it says. And the other thing is then when they open that envelope and it actually says you match, they're happy as all get out. Because they said, oh, I thought about it. I struggled, but oh, good, you helped me. You got it. So again, a happy situation, still ended up matching, no worries. So.
Just one last comment on that before going to case 4. This may also be the time to sort of leverage personal connections that we all have with, between clerkship directors and program directors. This is often the student that we feel bad when we look at the SLOE because, we feel we've written it the right way and it's honest and it's fair, but the letter may not paint the impression of the student that we really have. And these are the ones that, I will try my best to go to bat for and say, I know on paper they just look kind of ordinary, or maybe there's something that, they may need some guidance in one area, but they will really be a great resident if you just offer them an interview if you can and see for yourself.
And as a program director, I've taken a few of those. I've gotten a few of those calls and taken them. I've actually, on more than one occasion, arranged a late visit at my program where they came. I've had a couple that have come for a full rotation. I had one that came for a weekend, and it made a difference. So those phone calls do make a difference sometimes.
Tommy,
do you guys have any kind of guidance for how often is too often to do that? When do we cross the line with abusing? I'll do that a couple times a year too, but when the third person walks up, I start to think, I don't know that I want to keep pushing my luck on this.
I think you have to really pick the person you're doing it for, that it has to really be that kid that is going to be a superstar, but is not getting the chance. And it can't be, it can't be that kid that you're like, I really like him, but he really struggled in the department, and I don't know. If you're thinking that's because you're right. Once I hit 4 or 5 of them, it's a problem.
Sometimes you can find those late rotation opportunities on the CDM website. A friend of yours who you know works well with choir students can take them for a couple of weeks or a month.
Okay.
A good audition rotation in a place that likes you. You really only need one place if they really like you.
I think we'll take Doug's comment and then move on to student
just
4.
in response to that, I was going to say, I don't think it's how often. I think it's how well that student works out. And I would say, if you call me and you send me that student, you need to follow up and just say, hey, how did that kid work out for you? Is my sense of his fit for your program on target, or was I way off base? Because if you send me a kid that turns out to be no good, I'm going to say, nah, I don't think I'm going to take any more from Tom.
Okay, you guys can and probably already have read this case. I've had actually sort of 2 that kind of fall into this general category, and my guess is others have as well. And I see my colleague Cheryl Heron in the back of the room, and this is very much sort of pertinent to a point that she made in her plenary address with that kind of dark slide that came up, which is, I think, gets to the point that it's easy to talk the talk, and it becomes a little harder to walk the walk. I think most of us have fairly progressive views when it comes to mental illness and addiction. But it's one thing to have views, and it's another thing to really go out on a limb and take a chance with someone in your program who is, to be fair, a risk that they may have to drop out, and a risk that may put an extra burden on the rest of your residents and your program. So this is a case of a student who really sort of took their own initiative to realize that that he had a problem. Never showed up for work impaired, but recognized that he had a problem and took the time off and did the things that he needed to do, and came back and finished, and was otherwise an extremely strong student, one of our best of the year. I will say that in this case, what saved him is a program director that I really believe to be a saint, because he took a chance where a lot of other people didn't want to. So I'll open this up for sort of conversation and what you guys have done when you've had similar issues.
Yeah, we get this not infrequently, and a lot of it is, if you have a student who can truly be honest about it, you're starting at a really good place. Because you have to go through with them, look, people aren't supposed to ask you why you took this year off, but they might. You have to get them to feel comfortable with what do they want to talk about, right? How confessional do they want to be in the interview? How much do they want to share? And here are the pros and cons of sharing this much and versus sharing that much. And it's also getting them to look at places that might be better fit. I am in New Orleans. If you have an alcohol problem, we are not a good program for you. And we are very, hey, right? We have drive-through daiquiri, and not that we think, we are sensitive and we have support systems in place, but we don't want to put you at risk or any more danger than you already are. So let's talk about where you think might be safe places for you. And then, like you said, it's using that personal connection to be like, okay, you're going to this area. Let's figure out what kind of supports they have if this becomes an issue for you.
So I had a request for the program directors in here. How many of you would glide by this student and not even look at their application? Are we being honest? Now, here's the thing. How do you aren't going to know necessarily unless they've had a DUI. Then you might know. And I'm going to be perfectly honest as a program director. On mine, if they have one DUI, I'll look at them. If they've had 2 alcohol-related incidences, I probably won't. They're too much of a risk.
Other comments? Go ahead.
So this is really a question, but I'm curious about what you all think about whether this should be addressed in the personal statement, because the MSP is not going to give the specifics, but do you think that the student should actually go, because they may get asked about it, should they just grab the bull by the horns, talk about it in a paragraph in their personal statement or not?
Well, let's be honest a little bit. We don't know what it is. It could be MS, that medical issue. It could be Crohn's disease, could be cancer. So I think that it all depends on what the student, how comfortable the student is with it, because they can ask about the break, but they don't have to tell them. All they have to say is it's medical issues. So I think that I personally tell my students to be as open and honest as they can about it. And that if you are open and honest and own up to it and say, but listen, I haven't had a drop of alcohol for 2 years, then that may make a difference. So.
And another very related issue is, what if it wasn't alcohol? What if it was drugs? What if the person had a prescription drug issue in the past and it comes up that they ended up in rehab for that reason? And if you do train that person, can they even get a DEA license? Can they practice? And so maybe if someone is prone to using sort of these inadequate stress coping mechanisms, then maybe our super stressful job is not a great fit. And it seems like for this student, the guy was great in emergency medicine, did really well. But there is that question of if you are prone to these issues, maybe you shouldn't be around all of these really high-risk drugs, and in this really stressful environment, it might not be a great fit. And I think as the advisor, it's probably time for a really honest conversation. And if you do have drug issues, you probably can't get a DEA.
So we only have minutes for a couple more comments, so I'm going to try to move to the back.
Real quick question about the legal aspect of this. Let's say, so you reached out to a program director that was willing to take a risk on this individual. Did that program director, because they now knew it was an alcohol-related issue, discuss this with the legal team? So looking forward, if the program director knew it was alcohol-related, and let's say the worst-case scenario happens, the intern comes in drunk, takes care of a patient, something happens, and the program director then knew about this when they brought this in. So is this a situation where if you have something like that, substance abuse previously, recommend you have a discussion with your legal team as to whether or not your institution is okay with this potential risk?
I don't have the answer to that question other than to say that we all know that there are impaired physicians that have gone through treatment that are practicing. And, there's always that risk of relapse. Does it make a difference because we're talking about residents as opposed to sort of fully graduated independent physicians? I don't think so.
All right, we're going to do the last comments back here, and then we have to wrap up.
So we didn't have a student. We had a resident from another residency come to our program, and it was a drug issue that got them out of their prior residency. And he turned out to be one of the best residents we've ever had. He was particularly strong in his own residency, but it was a substance issue. He actually spoke, I think, at court back when it was in Arizona 2-3 years ago, whenever that was. But the whole point I was going to say is I would encourage them to be as open and honest and forthright about it as can. And then you have to have a discussion with your entire faculty and everyone else about there is a huge potential issue here, but we feel this person, he was very open, very straightforward, very solid plan, but it was completely out in the open and everyone knew about it and we all discussed it before we would accept him. So he's gone on to talk to people about it quite openly and actually give public talks about his issues. So, and he's phenomenal. So I would just encourage everyone to be as open as you can.
One last comment.
Mine's really more of a question. So, it sounds like in your example, the student was very forthright and open about his situation, but that's actually not the norm. And you mentioned that, you as the PD won't always know. A lot of times we as the clerkship directors will, either because the student has confided in us during the advising process or because it's come up at promotions or disciplinary committee. And I'm just wondering how people feel about the ethics of if and when and how you talk about that information with program directors, because on the one hand, it's, we have a duty to confidentiality for the student, but on the other hand, it's a legitimate part of that student's projected future performance, and we're obligated to be honest about that.
Any thoughts? Any quick last thoughts on that one? I personally, I'm actually, because I hold both hats, I know both sides, so it's not hard for me.
I think as we advise these students, we have an obligation to encourage them to be open and honest about what their gap is. Any unexplained gap in their medical school curriculum, if it's not explained in the personal statement, plus probably somewhere in one of their letters, I really do worry about that unexplained gap. If we encourage them to be open and honest about what their gap is and they choose not to, then they're just not following good advising. But any unexplained gap to me is, if it's explained well, we'll look at their application.